This week I'm joined once again by writer and occultist John Michael Greer for another episode discussing his book The King in Orange, The Magical and Occult Roots of Political Power, alongside discussions on freedom, desire and mimetics. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers for supporting the podcast, and if you would like to support the podcast as it keeps us going, please find links in the description below. Enjoy. So, John Michael Greer, thanks very much once again for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Well, thank you for having me on. I always enjoy being here.
You've sent me the sort of galley proof of The King in Orange before it's been published. So I've got the dates here. It should be out in the UK on the 24th of June. So the full title is The King in Orange, The Magical and Occult Roots of Political Power, which in very brief description is a sort of a new entry into the occult works, which are also social critique and sort of social overview in terms of politics, occultism, and how one and two come together. But this one specifically, obviously, with The King in Orange, is to do with the recently basically erased from history Donald Trump. And it's astounding me. Even if you are on the left or the right or you're red and blue, it is actually amazing to me how quickly what they called like the Trump energy has gone. That is absolutely dissipated from existence. So I spoke to you before about Curtis Yarvin's idea that you get Biden in power and all of a sudden they don't have that like antagonist to target everything on, and actually, I would have to agree with him and say that prediction was correct. But so why, how did this book originally come about, and how has it changed? Because I know you've been working on it for a while. So, what was the path of its change, I guess, as well.
Okay, well, it started really. I don't know. This would really make a great opening to an H.P. Lovecraft story. I could never have realized when I first started tracking the career of Donald Trump that strange things would rise from this kind of stuff. But it was really kind of like that. Back in 2015, when he first started his run for the presidency, I was watching this and going, "This is funny. This is amusing." I mean, we have a reality TV star trying out for the ultimate reality TV job, President of the United States. But watching the whole political system start to twist around him into practically non-Euclidean shapes, I realized very quickly that something really odd was going on. And so I started discussing it in the blog I had in those days, the Archdruid Report. I started talking about, okay, what is going on? What is up here? And it was January of 2016 that I predicted that he was going to win the election. I was looking at how he was just brushing aside one Republican after another easily, and how Hillary Clinton was basically buying the Democratic ticket, although very, very few people were actually enthusiastic about her. The media was, of course, whipping up its canned enthusiasm, but most people were going, "Yeah, Hillary, okay." But people were not going, "Yeah, Trump, okay." People were crazy about him. They either adored him, or they loathed him. There was no middle ground. And so I started watching that. And now this, as of course our listeners may recall from previous discussions, this was right about the time that I started writing my tentacle novels, my series The Weird of Hali and its associated novels. That was in fact in the summer of 2015 that I started working on those, where I had the first novel come crashing into my imagination pretty much in a lump. And right about the time, in fact, that Donald Trump came down that golden escalator. And so I was busy soaking myself in Lovecraft, soaking myself in other authors from the golden age of the weird tale in the 1930s and its precursors. And I was looking at things and saying, why am I noticing so many similarities here? There's this same sense of some forbidden horror from the dawn of time rising up into a world that thinks it's all sane and rational. And so it just kind of built from there. And what I did was, of course, I wrote quite a number of blog posts in the Archdruid Report and later on my current blog, Ecology, trying to analyze what was going on, trying to analyze why are people getting bent out of shape the way they are about someone who's ultimately just another politician. And that led in that of course in a classic Lovecraftian sense led in one eerie direction after another, and I ended up having to do a lot of thinking about the nature of class prejudice in the United States, the nature of our class system over here, which nobody talks about but is pervasive, and it led me into paying attention to murmurs I was getting during the election. But there was something really strange going on in the chans, in these online anonymous message boards, 4chan, 8chan, and so on. The people were actually doing magic there, and they were doing magic for the Donald Trump campaign. I was able to talk to some people who were involved in that. They actually, some of them sought me out because I was talking about the Trump thing. I was talking about magic, and I was being reasonable about it rather than just flying off the handle and shrieking this or that, for either side. And so, very gradually, I began to piece things together. I had the book finished in pretty much complete draft. Let's see, it would have been the fall of 2019. And I started shopping it around to publishers who make a big deal about doing really antinomian, really radical, really dangerous books. That was one of the funniest experiences of my life, because all of these people who prided themselves on edgy things, I either got back profanity-laced denunciations or I got dead silence. Mm-hmm. None of them wanted to touch it. I finally was able to find a publisher. Inner Traditions was interested. They, unlike some of the would-be edgelords, they are serious about publishing dissident thinkers. They publish a lot of traditionalists and people like that who are, of course, persona non grata in today's intellectual world. And so they picked it up, and we had some discussions, and it took a little revision, and then, of course, the election happened, and I was able to work that in without too much difficulty, and so out it came. But it was a long, strange trip. It was very much the kind of experience of the character in a Lovecraft or a Robert W. Chambers story or a Clark Ashton Smith story, where everything starts out looking perfectly normal, and then you know how it goes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's funny you began there actually with my first question, because you mentioned this idea of, up until Trump, we lived within that this sort of political enlightened rationality where whichever side won, we still remain within that same sort of paradigm or spectrum of thought, sort of the same Overton window, which was still contained within rationality. If you're conservative, well, it's at least still rational, and if you're liberal, it's at least still rational. We have these disagreements, but actually all these people are on the same spectrum as far as I'm concerned. I mean, conservatives these days are basically liberals in low gear, right? And what's really funny, one anecdote which someone linked to me just as Biden was a few days after Biden was sworn in, actually, was the Clinton roast, right? So this is like when Trump is running. So this would be 2015, I believe. 2015?
Yeah.
So it's
2015,
like,
2016.
and it's sort of maybe like, they thought, he might get a token gesture, a few thousand votes. So he's in the running, so they bring him along to the roast to roast Clinton. And you can see all the laughter from Clinton and everyone else there is sort of laughing at Donald, even though he's being really scathing towards them. But their faces show something of, this is just never going to happen. He's never going to get in, so we don't have anything to worry about. He can say what he wants. He's got his... And then, of course, what happens is we finally enter into collective, what most people would deem collective irrationality. Something has happened which isn't what we consider to be rational. So that's the first question there. It's something you begin to outline in the start of the book is, why is it that we really desire to live in what we deem to be a rational, quite in quotation marks, a rational world?
Well, the place we need to start to understand that is to remember that human beings are not too bright. We are not these godlike intellects capable of mastering the cosmos. We're a bunch of social primates on the third rock from a nondescript star in one little corner of a very large universe. We are not But we, in this culture, we have this fantasy, these sort of delusions of godhood. And the whole fixation on rationality is part of that, because the idea that the universe must be rational is ultimately the claim that the universe must be simple-minded enough that we can understand it. I can think of few more idiotic claims. In fact, our reason, what we call rationality, what we call reason, is simply a set of models. It's a very rough set of models about how we think the world ought to work. Now, very often it does work that way. We've evolved those models through a lot of trial and error. But when people end up looking at something as straightforward as the election of Donald Trump and say, no, this cannot be, it is not rational, then what you're seeing is not a function ultimately of rationality, but of emotions that have taken over the mantle of rationality. Here is our conventional wisdom. We can't bear to see it disrupted. Therefore, we're going to throw a tantrum. And, that basically is the history of America from about 2015 to about 2020.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's funny. Earlier I was writing something on about the West in terms of the very famous saying, which actually a lot of Westerners love to say. That the one by Heraclitus. One may not step twice into the same river. And I was sort of writing about it and thinking, actually, I think in the West it's so misinterpreted now. We have this idea that really it's like the river represents some tiny thing which is changing. I don't know, like cars are going to fly, and that's the change. But people never really accept the full depth of that quote, which is the river's changing, you're not the same, the river's not the same. The whole point is the entire, you put a box around that quote, it is pure flux, everything is changing. And yet it still surprises people when, okay, we have two options, A and B. Which option has happened? C. Wait, that can't, that can't happen. So then the panic sets in.
The panic sets in. Have you noticed, back in the day of when you had these science fiction serials like Flash Gordon, okay, right before the Zirconian generator blows up and vaporizes the evil mastermind and his minions of terror and his fortress of despair and everything, the last thing he always says is, no, this cannot be.
Mm-hmm,
Boom.
mm-hmm.
Okay, and I think to some extent we're still waiting for the explosion, but our collective imagination has spent the last 5 years, or that of the comfortable classes, that of the corporate media, that of the establishment of our time, have been shrieking, no, this cannot be, just like Ming of Mongo. So, if the Zirconian generator blows up on them, as I suspect it might, they have only themselves to blame. They're that's in the script.
Mm-hmm. I think the really big question that I drew personally from The King in Orange, because it is a political, an occult political book, and it's something I actually, like, one of the few times I've really disagreed with you, unfortunately. Well,
okay, good.
In a good way. Yeah, in a good way. So, we can dig into this. But I mean, perhaps I misread it, but I'm fairly sure that at one point you explicitly state this, which is that you state that magic always has a political context.
Mm-hmm.
I completely disagree with that. I mean,
okay, great. Let me explain what I mean by that. Okay. Because politics is about the relationships between people governed by power. Okay, Who has what power is the basic political setup. The basic question of politics, the basic structure that runs all through politics, the fact that Joe Biden can now have certain kinds of power, can do certain things that Donald Trump cannot. That's what our election was about. The fact that, we, citizens of the United States, have certain rights, that is to say, certain powers that citizens of some other countries do not have, that's also a matter of politics. And, of course, vice versa. But so basically what I'm saying by that is that magic always affects the distribution of power between people. And so attitudes toward magic within a society are always shaped by the political setting of the society. So when, to use an example I drew on in my book, when African Americans after slavery got very deep into hoodoo, into root work, the particular transformation of Bakongo magic that became North American hoodoo, conjure, whatever you want to call it, work, that took place in a political context. It was shaped by the political realities that African Americans lived in that time, and it took the forms it did because of those political pressures. And if you want to understand it, you've got to see, okay, what are the politics here? Similarly, if you want to understand the magical dimensions of modern neo-paganism, you have to realize that it's basically the recreation of a privileged class.
Okay.
The great majority of neo-pagans come from the educated middle classes. They are not. It is not a religion of the poor or the marginalized. It's, and everything they're doing and all of the magic they're engaged in is shaped by their position of privilege in exactly the same way that the African Americans, their magic was shaped by their position of disprivilege.
Okay. I mean, I can sympathize with that understanding. I mean, I was probably using understanding the word political in a fairly constrained context. So, I mean, once you expand it into that notion of power, then what someone is undertaking with a personal ritual of self-development or undertaking a sigil, which is going to change the world, or change their consciousness in some way, is something which is going to emancipate them from a conditioned reality, which has been conditioned by institutional politics. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
Because every political system is ultimately a magical spell. And if you choose to counter that spell, if you use magic of your own to step out of the illusion that spell is casting on you, then you have engaged not only in a powerful magical act, but in a profoundly political act.
Do you think there's any outliers or anomalies in that sense? I'm thinking of, in ancient terms, thinking of the Desert Fathers, or people who are just completely monastically ascetic and so detached from society that it's not even something which, even is really, a thing for them.
Oh yeah, and the thing is, that's what like the Desert Fathers, or their equivalents now, who are mostly here in the United States. They're living in abandoned national forest campgrounds and things like that. The act of distancing yourself from a society is a way of responding to the society, to its politics. It's a rebellion on a personal level. So when the Desert Fathers say, no, I'm not going to do what I'm supposed to do according to the edicts of the emperor. Mind you, and remember, they came about at a time when there was a law in the empire that you had to go into whatever business your father had. Even if you couldn't make a living at it, you were legally forced to do so. It was an attempt to prop up their failing economy. And the Desert Fathers were rebelling against that. They were saying, no, I am not going to prop up your failing economy. I'm not going to prop up this failed system. I am going to go into the desert and live in a cave and devote my time to prayer and meditation and that itself was a profoundly revolutionary act, because many of the most talented people of the time were doing that. They were pulling the plug on the empire as they did it.
It's a dangerous act, though. I think any sincere or authentic path of magic always needs to be understood in the context the one's within. You can't simply say, no, I don't want to do that. That is a surefire way to sort of develop the longer you push something down, it's going to spring back up harder at some point.
And of course, that was an important part of what shaped the whole phenomenon I was dealing with. One of the things that made the rise of Donald Trump inevitable was precisely that the attitude, the desires and the needs and the economic status of the, quote, deplorables, unquote, had been erased from American consciousness. The media would not talk about it, except to point fingers and blame the victims. And so it reached a flashpoint. That has not changed. And so all of these people who are trying to pretend that Trump never existed in the first place, they're simply guaranteeing that we're going to get another one.
Oh yeah, we'll get another one, but it'll be far worse. I mean,
well, we might be lucky. Now, you never know what's actually going to happen. It could be much worse. The next one could be much more efficient. I mean, Trump is an entertainer. That's what he does. And he put a lot of energy into making a lot of noise and to having a lot of fun with the Democrats. And if he had been one of these cold, calculating, capable types who end up becoming presidents for life in other countries, we would have been in a lot of trouble. And a lot of the people who are now preening themselves as being members of the resistance and all this kind of stuff would be in shallow graves today.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
We could get that. We could very easily get that. There are a lot of people who are sufficiently feel sufficiently disenfranchised, sufficiently they know their voices will not be heard, their needs will not be met. The political system does not care if they live or die. That's the kind of thing that can lead to a dictatorship, because those people will turn to anyone who will listen to them, who will give them a voice. And if that person happens to have a fondness for jackboots and armbands, well, we know where that leads.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually one of the theories which I personally see playing out, at least roughly in correlation, which is the idea that America is actually mirroring the Weimar Republic.
I did a post about 6-7 years ago titled "Weimar America," with making exactly that point. Yes, I think you're quite right.
It's probably your theory, but I mean, the in the Weimar Republic you had hyperinflation, the economy was going to pop, people weren't being listened to, and there was also these very small, strange sort of connections. In the Weimar Republic, there was a massive increase in like pushing LGBT politics and things along these lines. And whether or not you agree or disagree with that, the point is that it is mirroring what happened in the Weimar Republic, and we all know what happened after the Weimar Republic.
Exactly. And the thing is, in the Weimar Republic also, you had a small minority of politically well-connected people on the extreme left who were pushing a radical Marxist agenda. And we rather have that in the United States also. And all that it did was drive people over to the other extreme. And I don't think the people who are capering around in city streets in the United States right now, breaking windows and spraying paint on walls and beating people up and so on, they have no clue that what they're doing is simply potentially laying the groundwork for a dictatorship that will land with a lot of them in camps.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, one of the statistic I saw, I think it was just a couple of days ago, actually, was over 60% of Americans are now afraid to express their political opinions, which is what we all know which opinions can't be expressed, and the longer people are scared to do that, the more and more time there is to develop. Someone just needs to come along. But I mean, there's also the sympathy of James Howard Kunstler's opinion, which is that, okay, we've primed the stage for someone to come along, but do we actually have that charismatic foundation for such a person to even exist anymore? Could there be such a charismatic person? And that's always
you see, I think we do. If you watch the way people get goopy about Hollywood figures, the fact that anybody on Earth cares about Kim Kardashian shows that we've got an immense reservoir of hero worship built up. And if you this is one of the places where it really helps to try to get out of the sort of 20/20 hindsight. If you actually read things from, say, the late 1920s, very early 1930s, written about this goofy-looking young man in Germany named Adolf Hitler, people thought he was a clown. People thought he might get into office, but he'll be thrown out in weeks. Jung talks about that in his essay Wotan, how everyone just assumes he's just, that this is just the ordinary turmoil of post-war German politics, and he's a crackpot and he'll be out shortly. People had no idea. And they certainly did not see him as the kind of charismatic figure who could seize control of the destiny of one of the world's great nations. And in fact, that's what happened, because he didn't have to have the charisma. As long as there were that many people who were ready for somebody, they would have taken anybody.
Yeah.
He just happened to be the right person at the right time. As it is, we have easily half a dozen people in the Republican Party who are very obviously positioning themselves for a presidential run. We've got Ron DeSantis in Florida. We've got Kristi Noem as governor of South Dakota. We have Senator Ted Cruz. Those are just the three that come first to mind. All of them have frankly better media skills than Trump ever dreamed of having. All of them have some experience as practical politicians, which he didn't. And any one of them could aim for the presidency or the presidency for life or some slightly fancier title. Or it could be somebody entirely different. We don't know yet. But it's a mistake to assume that just because we don't see anybody who currently has that glow of media glamour that we couldn't be hitting for that. Go on.
Well, it's actually, it does lead into a huge part of your book, which I think is under the surface through the whole thing. This idea that you put forth of these, the people saying, who's this funny Hitler fella, he'll never get in. I think the question needs to be asked is much in the same way as who is writing for The Guardian now, which is, who are these people saying, who are the people who are saying this person isn't going to get in? And usually, when you read something like The Times or The Guardian, I don't know what the equivalent would be in America, it's a lot of...
the Washington Post and the New York Times, go on.
It's a lot of projection from people who are ignoring what used to be the working class. Now, it was really almost refreshing for me to read something which has... Because the class debate is unless you're in very and I don't mean this as a slight against your book, but the whole debate of class is basically gone, even from left-wing thought, unless you are in a really old school Marxist, like we're the proletariat, really the diehard classical Marxist approach. It's really interesting to me and refreshing to see this come back in, but in an interesting way. And I hope you don't mind the comparison here, but your argument, the argument I was going to compare you to is actually of Ted Kaczynski, who makes the argument about. So he makes the argument with multiculturalism, and he says there's no such thing as multiculturalism. All cultures have been homogenized into one culture of a certain quote unquote middle class, which are just trying to buy stuff, right? It doesn't matter if you're from black culture or Asian culture or whatever. You've all been assimilated into the same thing. And if you walk around in your average Western city, you aren't going to see all these multiple cultures. And I think you make the argument with this idea of this single class. You call it the salary class. Everyone has been homogenized into this.
But except that word "everyone" is an interesting one, because the salary class is only about 15% of the population.
Exactly.
Ted Kaczynski's problem is that he belonged to the salary class in his mind, his thoughts. I mean, one of his problems, he had a number of them, but one of his problems was that his thoughts were entirely shaped by salary class ideology. Now, in fact, I can start walking from the apartment that I live in, a slightly down at heels neighborhood of East Providence, Rhode Island, and I could very quickly be in areas where there is a really different culture involved. It has not been homogenized at all. It's just that as you rise through the class pyramid, once you pass into the salary class, you have got to have the approved very narrow range of opinions. You've got to have the approved very narrow range of lifestyles, because that's part of your class signal. That's how you signal your belonging to the good people, to the aristocracy of our time. Mm-hmm. And so if you drop down below that, if you stay out of the clutches of the salary class monoculture, there's an enormous amount of cultural activity going on. Even in a dowdy New England town like Providence, there are not merely subcultures but national cultures that are still thriving. From overseas, there are local cultures. It's a lively place, but that never makes the media. That never makes the collective conversation, which is curated by the corporate media and generally by the establishment of our time, because the fantasy and the reason why the leftist parties have abandoned the working class. Of course, they have. The Democratic Party cares no more about the working class than your Labor Party over on your side of the pond. They're all parties of the salary class, of the managerial class. And they don't want to listen to the working class. They want to tell the working class what they're going to do for them. Mm-hmm. I'm reminded. Oh, come on. Chesterton's poem, The Hidden People, and the weight of their loveless pity is worse than the ancient wrongs. He was talking about the salary class.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, this is what I was going to say, is that there's the old quote by Steinbeck that you have a nation of temporarily embarrassed millionaires, and that was in the 20s. So a million was it 20s? I think. I'm
Yeah,
trying to
yeah.
think. Yeah, 20s. So
So
£1 million then is genuinely what we still think of as £1 million. That's the American dream. Whereas now, I would say you can change that quote to a nation of temporarily embarrassed salary class people, which isn't even a dream, right? That's not even a dream. Temporarily embarrassed people who just want a 9 to 5 job. That's and this is the point that you make, as you say, actually the actual class of salary class, 15% of people. But what I meant when I say everyone is in that Steinbeck sense of struggling to get into that, and they consider themselves in it even if they're not truly in it. They consider themselves in it in spirit, right? They're like, that's the thing which is now the dream.
You see, that's the thing that's cracking now. And that's the thing that the presidency of Donald Trump has really set in motion. You increasingly have people who are not part of the salary class who have come to despise the salary class. They've come to reject its values. They've come to reject its notion of wealth. They're perfectly willing to have more money, but they're increasingly building a wage class mentality, a wage class ideology, a wage class set of values over and against the salary class. That is one of the main reasons why the salary class has been melting down in shrieking tantrums. Because the whole vision of the salary class has been, it's a Star Trek fantasy, a universe where everyone belongs to the middle class. Or the upper middle class. Everyone has exactly the same values, exactly the same ideas, exactly the same lifestyles. No dissent is tolerated outside of those incredibly narrow grounds because we're the good people and this is the right way to live. That's basically their attitude. And the fact that over the last 5 years, we've seen the emergence of an utterly recalcitrant working class, wage class mentality that is not subservient to Marxism, that is not subservient to liberalism, that is saying, no, those are not our values. These are our values. And if you want to talk to us, you need to talk about these values. When a class like our salary class has defined itself as the vanguard of the future, the people who matter, the people who run things, history's actors, to borrow a once famous phrase, all of a sudden realize there are a whole bunch of people who do not care what they think and actually think they're kind of stupid. That's unbearable to them. So of course they're shrieking and melting down.
But it used to be sort of a fairly big. The class thing was just on its last legs when I was younger, and I think it sort of disappeared. This idea of what class you came from, and there was a general acceptance of the trio of working, middle, and upper, and. I can't remember the quote, but to paraphrase yourself, the idea of the middle class is really in this notion of lifestyle in terms of what value you hold, and actually you've made it clear in numerous essays that outside of people's homes, even though most of them are just debt and credit and mortgages, which in terms of how they're being paid off, they're paying blah 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 whatever APR. Most people don't have much of value. Take away the house, there's very little. They have TVs, they have gizmos, they have etc., but they don't really have a coherent communal culture. Or in certain places they do, but there isn't anything of sort of an intrinsic value. And so this whole notion of what it is to belong to a class then just rides on this sort of veil of an aesthetic, and you utilize in the book another book which I ordered straight away because you mentioned it so many times. I thought I have to read this. There must be something going on here, which was The Razor's Edge, right? And this book articulates this point of someone who is, in the upper class or in what we'd probably now consider the upper middle class, who sees through all this nonsense, this veil of this extremely thin veil, which once it's there and you objectively see it, you can pop it with a pin, and says, no, like I can't accept this delusion anymore.
Yeah, and in fact, Larry Darrell, not the narrator, but the character who matters in The Razor's Edge, he's actually a great metaphor for our time, and also a great measure of the distance. Because again, he's from the era when to be a member of the privileged class meant that you had invested income. You didn't have to work for your living. I commented in one of actually I think it's in the book as well that. nowadays, if Somerset Maugham were to be reincarnated and to do a new version of it, he'd have to have Larry Darrell walk away from a plush corporate job with a 7-figure salary and a lavish benefits package, because that's the class marker nowadays. And but the principle is again the same. Yeah, once you realize that the fact that you belong to this class, the fact that you have these labels, the fact that you signal your virtue, because of course all aristocracies engage in virtue signaling, the fact you signal your virtue in these ways does not mean that you have a clue. It does not mean that you are leading a life worth living. It may simply be a little bit, of a thin veil of self-importance over void. And the character in the Razor's Edge in Mom's novel sees that, and he sets out to actually have a life. And so, of course, everyone is completely baffled. It's a great novel. It is seriously one of my favorite novels, precisely because it portrays that so clearly.
Sort of the Western equivalent of Siddhartha, which I could never really get into that. But it reminds me actually of a fairly cheap cartoon, but I always found it funny. It's like this, just a cartoon of a sidewalk, people passing by and a homeless person, and there's like a man in a suit and there's a student, and it lists their jobs. So the man in the suit, businessman or whatever, and then retail worker, and then there's the homeless guy, and then it says their net worth, and the man in the suit, he's got a house and he's got a car, so he's minus 5,000 in debt, and then the retail worker is, just a student probably renting, so they're like minus 20 in their overdraft, and then obviously the homeless person, he's just been given change, so he's the only one in the clear. He's got like 20 cents.
He's got a net worth of 20 cents.
Exactly. So and I always think of that. The statistic which was released fairly recently when I walk around, or when I drive around and walk around locally, which is that 80% of cars are on credit. And once you begin to realize what's on credit in people's lives, you realize that the amount of genuine value that people have in terms of monetary or in terms of other things is so abysmally small that, the culture of sort of, it's just a culture of resentment in the face of this aesthetic veil that we were talking about. All these cars are on credit, and people absolutely kill themselves, quite literally, to maintain this.
Whereas to walk away from it, that's scary. But that's the way that freedom lies. And that's one of the reasons why things are in such turmoil now, because some people are starting to at least dimly grasp that this sort of lifestyle on credit, where you're constantly in hock, you're constantly deluged with bills, you're constantly being told, buy more stuff on credit so you can be even more miserably in debt, that maybe it's not worth it. That maybe there is a thing called having a life, which involves not having these things so that you have the freedom to do what you want. And so that's beginning to stir in, I think, a lot of minds. And it's one of the reasons that things are so hysterical, because the people who are benefiting from the existing system, the people who are getting very rich by convincing everyone else to go over their heads in debt, they depend, ultimately they don't depend on jackboots. They don't depend on force. They depend on the ability to convince people to act against their own best interests and to buy all this crap on credit and to pay far more than it's worth in monthly payments with all the interest and everything. And this is one of the things I talk about in my book, of course, because all of this can best be understood as magic. We're taking, this lump of plastic and metal, which more or less does the job of taking you down the street, okay? And yet people are not being sold a lump of plastic and metal that more or less does the job of getting down the street. Look at advertising these days. It has nothing to do with the practicalities. It has nothing to do with what good you actually get out of this thing, if any. It's all emotion. It's all, get this car and the freedom of the open road, which is exactly what you won't have, of course, because you'll to get this car, you're going to go over your head in debt, and that means you're working in 40 hours a week plus overtime. Or my favorite example is soft drink ads. Soft drinks have basically no value whatsoever. We've got fizzy brown sugar water. That's all it is. And yet, look at the ads. It's all people having fun. They're young. They're glamorous. They're sexy. They're laughing. They're brandishing these bottles of fizzy brown sugar water. And you're supposed to get caught up in that and end up with this notion that just below the conscious mind that says, if I buy fizzy brown sugar water, I'll be like those people. And it works because people don't think, because people don't go, okay, why are they trying to sell me tooth decay in a bottle? Well, because they want me to spend my money. Because they want me to waste my money on fizzy brown sugar water. Aha, I understand this. I know how to mess with them. In case you haven't wondered, I don't drink soft drinks.
Well, I mean, there's an interesting, it's almost like if you were to write a chaos magic book of self-development, you could try to objectively look at a can of, the actual Coke itself, pour it into a glass and meditate on what Coke is.
Yeah.
And see, try work out why it is that you want to put that black, viscous, sparkling liquid that, which if you came across that in terms of, if you were going through a ripe jungle full of fruits and potentially grains, and you came across a stream of black, viscous, fizzy liquid, you would Darwinianly, you would go.
You would back away from it.
We shouldn't be ingesting this.
Well, especially if you take a moment to kind of break it into its components. You have your can of fizzy brown sugar water. Okay, 1/3 of that can is corn syrup. Mm-hmm. If you can imagine 1/3 of a can drinking down 1/3 of a can of corn syrup, that's what you're doing every time you have one of those cans. There's the corn syrup, there's the water, there's the CO2, there's the cheap chemical flavorings, and that's it. Oh, caffeine! Don't forget the caffeine. Mm-hmm. And if you actually take a moment to think, okay, this is this, and this is, and take it apart, at least mentally, and then say, okay, why am I looking at ingesting this?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I mean, this actually leads to a sort of a bigger point, which I think is where I've sort of, we often talk about like why can't the majority of people sort of to back away? We've spoken about this idea, and I'm in complete agreement with you that where power is found is in this non-acceptance, and it reminds me of I don't like the artist, but I like his quote. So it's a quote by Picasso, and he says it took me my entire life to learn how to draw like a child. And I always read that as basically he's understanding that the mimicry and the realist conditioning that he'd been given in classical training, it took him a whole lifetime to understand why you could do other things. And I think this is why that magic will never appeal to the entire, especially to the Western world. I mean, I'm always talking about the Western world. The East is a different thing altogether. And I think this is why in the West, as I say, a culture of quantification, it just won't ever truly apply on a mass level. Because when we enter into something, we understand, right, what have I got to add to my life now? What's the thing what have I got to take? What have I got to wear? What have I got to do? What have I got to ingest? What have I got to learn? What have I got to prove? And it's always an addition. It's something you've got to add. And actually most of the power of occultism and many of the rituals is delving deep into your psychology and going, oh, by the way, there's a piece of conditioning here. You get rid of that. You don't need this anymore, which will lead you into debt. You don't need that anymore, which will lead you into a lot of, emotional troubles with love, et cetera, et cetera. And it's actually a process of slowly removing conditioning, which doesn't actually exist in the first place. You are self-hypnotizing yourself to maintain something. It's the Alan Watts goes on about the poetry competition of the fifth patriarch, and one monk writes about a monk has to clean his mirror, over and over and over again. And that one is, no, that's what it is. And the winning entry is the monk who goes, no, that there isn't a mirror. You've developed that idea that there is something that you constantly need to clean. So you need to first, understand on an occult, a hidden level, that your very understanding of how you're approaching the world can be altered. And that is, where, the Dion Fortune quote, which you emphasize many, many times again, which I'll let you say what the quote is, because I can't remember it. I
was thinking the definition of magic.
Yeah, the definition of magic, yeah.
The art and science is causing change in consciousness in accordance with will. Yeah. The thing is, magic is very much a matter of getting rid of things. That's why in most systems of magical training, the first ritual you learn is a banishing ritual, a ritual that chases things off. Because, in effect, we're loaded down with chains. Mm-hmm. And if you're loaded down with chains, the last thing you want to do is add more chains. You want to get rid of the chains. You want to shake off the shackles. You want to drop the lead weights and get rid of the cuffs and all this kind of stuff, and step forth naked and free. And that's what magic is about. That's what magic teaches you to do, so that the only burdens you carry are the ones you choose to carry, and you can always choose otherwise. And so, in a culture that's caught up in a materialist fantasy of happiness through piling up junk, the only culture in the history of the world in which the storage unit, the offsite storage unit, has become a major industry. Mm-hmm. We have so much crap. Even our oversized houses won't hold it all. To actually do the other thing and say, okay, what can I get rid of to be free? That is revolutionary. Mm-hmm. That stands everything on its head.
Mm. It's the way I've found to explain to people saving in the West, saving money or saving resources or whatever in a better way, is not how do you spend less, but how do you actually want less, so that's saving. When people go to like furniture, there's a sale on. No, you save money by not spending it. It's the same sort of watching people's minds, the cogs in people's minds almost break when you say to them, I know this person lives in just a 2-bedroom bungalow and they're perfectly happy. What do they do with all the, how do they have so much, how do they live like that? How do they have the room? They never, they had the understanding that they didn't need all the stuff that you don't even use.
Exactly. Yeah, my dad has this, I love the man, but sometimes he has this thing where he'll get something on sale that he does not need. Quote, well, it was so cheap I couldn't afford not to get it.
Couldn't afford not to get it.
Not to get it. Yes, you could have afforded not to get it. You could have kept the money in your pocket and done something else with it. But a lot of people are very much caught up in the consumer fantasy, and it is very profitable for corporate interests that people stay caught up in that consumer fantasy, that they remain convinced that if only they buy the right product, then the gates of heaven will open before them and bliss, blah, blah. And of course, that's exactly what won't happen, because of course, a happy person doesn't need to buy another product. So the whole system of modern industrial commercial life is to keep people miserable by feeding them products that promise them happiness and then don't make them happy. So they can keep on sort of chasing endlessly after, like in a greyhound racetrack, there's this mechanical rabbit that the greyhounds chase, and they can never catch it. It stays ahead of them. If they did, it's a mechanical rabbit. It's not even tasty. But this is a metaphor, I think, for the way a lot of people live these days. They're chasing this mechanical rabbit, which they will never catch. And even if they did, they'd find, it's just metal. And yet that keeps them running full out until they fall over dead. Mm-hmm. There must be more to life than that.
Yeah, that's the, going back to the can of cola thing, it's like, modernity is basically a system which develops a problem and then is heralded as great because it's found the solution, but people never think to stop and say, hang on, where did the problem come from? And I think really a great example of this is like skincare products. And people going, this one's people putting on 5 or 6 skincare products a day, and it's just about maintaining their complexion or whatever. And I think to myself, okay, there's 2 things going on there. One, why is your skin bad? We never used to just have universally bad skin all around. That's probably a diet from the Western world, which you're partaking in. And 2, what's wrong with having that? Who has told you that having a few blemishes or whatever is bad? So then those things are deemed bad, and then they're given the solution, which is the fantastic quote by David Foster Wallace, which is an advertisement is basically creates an anxiety which is relievable by purchase. And everyone's just running around in these states of artificial anxiety, which is relievable by, consumer therapy.
but only temporarily relievable.
Oh
And
no,
that's
you
a
need to
crucial
keep the
thing.
you need to keep the
Yeah,
anxiety. You've got to ramp it up.
It can never actually be solved. It can only be postponed. And well, actually, the skincare products are a great example, because the reason why so many people have bad skin these days is skincare products.
Mm-hmm.
They benefit in the short term and harm your skin in the long term.
Mm-hmm.
And so you want, if you've ever had the chance to compare for example, a woman who does not wear makeup, a woman who does. The woman who does wear makeup when she's young looks gorgeous, and then she hits 40 or 50, and her skin has become, the consistency of a paper bag, and it's because of all the stuff she's loaded onto it. Whereas a woman who does not use makeup, she doesn't have that, that va-va-voom look at the age of 20, but at the age of 40, her skin is still perfectly nice. Unless she's ruined it by excess dieting, of course. And you see, we have all of these ways that people are taught to make themselves as miserable as possible, so they'll keep chasing the mechanical rabbit of consumer goods. And to actually look at society as an arrangement to convince people to be as miserable as possible, so they'll keep on shopping. Once you see the world that way, it's kind of hard to unsee it, and at that point, you can actually really start changing your life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's power to be found in just using a bar of soap.
Exactly.
But there's something else you sort of bring up in the book off the back of this, which actually is a culture of exclusion, which sort of used to have the aristocracy, but then you also used to have I guess now would be understood as a relatively strangely educated working class who used to in the factories, you'd pay someone to read what we now consider a scholarly work, something by Orwell or along these lines, and then you used to have the aristocracy, and there was a separation. But actually, I think even now when we look back, we go, oh, it used to be such a class divide, but perhaps not in terms of people who wanted to understand the culture. And now actually you sort of make it clear that actually the culture of exclusion has been extremely exacerbated.
Yeah, no, we've got to a point where, partly, of course, there's the transformation of public education from a system of education to a system of class assignment, where I don't know a lot about your public schools on your side of the pond. Over here, most of them are frankly incredibly bad. The many big cities. Big city public school systems over here, half the graduating seniors at the end of their schooling are still functionally illiterate. Now, they've all passed all the relevant tests, but that's because all kinds of gimmicks are being used to teach the test, but they literally can't read a menu. And so you get, it's basically, I don't think that's accidental. And the fact that it's being defended as stridently as it is by the defenders of the status quo, by the teachers' unions, by the Democratic Party, and by the Republican Party before it got taken over by Trumpistas, the fact that there's so much resistance to what are called charter schools, which are independent of the school bureaucracies and can actually teach, and things like this. It's very clear. It's not accidental. The point is to dumb people down. The point is to provide babysitting services so both husbands and wives can work all day, and other than that, to keep kids from learning as thoroughly as they can. Just prevent them from learning so they don't have the basis to formulate a critique. It's what Orwell talked about in 1984 when he's talking about newspeak. If you make the language simple and stupid enough, then you don't have to worry about people being able to formulate their critiques. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of that's going on these days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, as Thomas Pynchon says, you get them asking the wrong questions. The answers don't matter. But in terms of schooling, I always turn to Ivan Illich, who I think was probably the most prophetic in terms of how close he got to what our schooling system is, which is, in short, our schooling system and what is understood as education mistakes process for substance. So just because you have been, in quotation marks, educated, therefore that equals that person is smart. That person is intelligent. You have done what do you need for this position? X. Have you got X? Yes. Right. Then you can do it. That's just complete nonsense. Our schooling system is basically probably much like yours, a system of process. You go through it, you do it, and it just prepares you for the world of work in which you are also just going to have to do things, sit at a computer and do a process. That's it's crazy to me that a whole system of education, and I actually can't really say much more about it than that. The when I think back to the few times I had good education, is actually the probably 3 or 4 tutors that I'm still in contact with, for the pure fact that they were just interesting people. They cared more about you understanding than you having the knowledge, and the difference is absolutely huge. Schools just want you to have knowledge. They don't want you to understand things.
Well, at this point, here on this side, they don't even want you to have knowledge. They want you to parrot back the right, politically correct utterances at that point, and then forget all about it because you'll never be asked that question again. So it's really quite embarrassing. But so that's an important part of the whole process of exclusion. But also, I feel a little uncomfortable talking to somebody British about a class system because, of course, yours is legendary. But we have extreme class divides here. We just don't talk about them. There's all the blither about, well, anyone can grow up to be president. Yeah, but it helps if you're, if you come from the right family. I don't think anybody has. Frankly, there are millions of Americans who are a lot smarter than Joe Biden, and they're not going to be president. But we have a very deeply entrenched class system here. It is a class system that does a certain amount of scooping from the gifted poor by way of the education system, and so we have the situation where if you are willing to surrender everything, if you're willing to go through your entire schooling, taking the right classes, doing the right extracurricular activities, adopting the right hobbies, having all the right opinions, being bright and cheerful and everything else that's then you can get into one of the elite colleges, and then if you're lucky, you'll end up being funneled into an elite position. And that happens. That's part of the way that the system works. It gets a steady stream of flunkies who are selected because of their literally reflexive obedience to the status quo. And that's what our education system is meant to do. On the one hand, to provide the system with its supply of flunkies, and on the other hand, to screen out anybody who is not well suited for flunkeydom. And there are a lot of those people being screened out. One of the things that happened in the whole the rise of Trump and the whole subculture of the Chans and so on is precisely because that's where the people who get filtered out end up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's interesting you brought back up this huge sort of class division, because I think something that has been almost resurrected in a feat of necromancy, which the elite didn't want to happen, is something which when I was younger in the 90s was still just about prevalent, which was the idea between the divide of the city and the country, and or the city and rural life, us country bumpkins are hurt and all that. That divide used to be known by both the people in the city and the people in the country, and actually they abided by it and were in a certain amount of agreement about it and didn't mind it. This went away for a while, but it was still there in terms of class as well, and it was brought back in droves, clear as day with Trump.
Exactly. The one of the things that happened during the period of predominance of the salary class was precisely the erasure of everyone outside it. One of the things I like pointing to here is back in the day, we're talking here 70s, back in the 1970s and earlier, you would have recipe columns in most newspapers, and they were normally perfectly ordinary working class food. They were the kind of things that ordinary housewives would or house husbands would use on a matter of course. That was replaced in the 1980s by these very, very precious, what I tend to call precious yuppie chow. These absurdly complex, absurdly expensive, absurdly unnourishing meals, because the idea was that the deplorable majority no longer exists We're going to pretend that they have vanished and that all that matters is the experience of the yuppies, the experience of the privileged classes, the salary classes, the people who are, who the important ones, the good people, and across the board, the media fixated on these imaginary happy lives of these far from imaginary corporate drones, and pretended that the other 85% of the population no longer existed. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so that's breaking down now, and that's another of the reasons, of course, that we're getting all the shrieking meltdowns, because no, those people aren't supposed to exist anymore. They're in the way of our heading for our imaginary Star Trek utopia.
Mm-hmm. And of course, these people these people who don't exist, because of their very existence as something is ignored, they're still abiding. They haven't been drawn into that yuppie
mm-hmm.
liberal life, which actually doesn't affect that many people, but seems to be the majority opinion of what is the correct way to live. And so in that sense, I'm thinking of my great aunt and uncle who both sadly gone now, but I think my great aunt ate pasta once, right? So that kind of lifestyle where they, you know what I mean? But that, so many people of the uppies that you're talking about wouldn't be funny. That would be like a life altering thing. That's so basic. But actually, there is still these people who are abiding by what would be considered unprogressive mm-hmm. or archaic. Mm-hmm. What are we having for dinner? Well, I went out and I got a rabbit or shot a pheasant. Mm-hmm. People still do mm-hmm. this, but it's glossed over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we pretend that doesn't exist because that's all assigned to the past. And in the ideology of industrialism, of course, the past is hell. The future is heaven. And we are, in that intermediate zone waiting for a techno Jesus to descend from, or more likely to rise up into the sky on a rocket to take us to heaven on Mars or something like that. Whereas, in fact, as across the board, we're starting to see the latest, brightest technologies flop. The classic example right now is the F-35 Lightning II, the present problem child of U.S. Military aviation, which was supposed to be this marvelous fifth-generation fighter that would do everything. The pilots call it the Penguin because it flies like one. And it's a lousy plane. And recently, they actually had to admit that they're going to have to come up with something else, because it turns out that when you put on the afterburners to get it to fly supersonic, you damage the tail.
Is that the one that cost $1.5 trillion over its lifetime?
Yeah, this is what it cost. I forget how many hundreds of billions of dollars a plane or something. I don't remember. It was some absurd amount per plane. Yeah, it was an umpty-trillion-dollar thing. And it's a total dog. And the reason why it's a total dog is that it's innovative. Mm-hmm. It's all cutting edge. It's pushing the boundaries. Well, it's pushed the boundaries, all right. But these people have failed to realize that the law of diminishing returns also applies to progress. Sooner or later, you push the boundary past the point where it can still do the job. Yeah. We have here in the U.S. also our latest class of aircraft carriers, the Gerald R. Ford class. And if you remember Gerald Ford, you know what a joke that is. But they were going to make like a dozen of them. Now they're going to make like 4. They're saying only 2 have had their keels laid yet. Oh, no, I think 2 of them have been built. Maybe one more has its keel laid. And there will probably be no more because they're lousy. Again, they were very cutting edge. We've had all of these cutting edge things, and at this point, the military is talking about resurrecting older plans, older jets, older ships, older helicopters because they work. And so the people who go out and shoot a rabbit for dinner, they're actually the way of the future. They're the cutting edge. It's just that the people who've built their lives around a Star Trek fantasy cannot deal with that. And that's another reason for the shrieking meltdowns.
Well, I think, it comes back to this question of power again, because when you think of those planes, it's sort of the macro version of the micro of people who buy a dishwasher. And you go, but didn't you have a sink and plates? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Did they work? Yeah, for many years. Why'd you get that? Oh, it works faster. Yeah, but what about the time that you have to spend loading it? The time you spend putting in the salts, buying the salts, earning the money to do it, repairs, and then they sort of fall apart. But of course, it looks fancy, and so I think when you talk about what works in terms of
Mm-hmm.
it shouldn't be you don't want to get caught up in the idea of whether or not there's a better or a worse, but it's more of do you find shooting a rabbit isn't for everyone, but if it is for someone, it doesn't have to be on that spectrum of like this is super technologically progressive or this is archaic. It's like we just do that, sort of like in one of your old essays about the family who lived as Victorians. It doesn't need to be like a statement. It's like we just live this way, or we just do this because why? We don't need a reason, because the reason, as soon as you start reasoning, it's almost like the progressive culture is something which is to be battled, which is like the real power is in saying no, I don't care about your abstraction of progress. I'm gonna,
Exactly. It's the reason why I don't own a television. It's not because, and that's something, by the way, that will upset people to a remarkable degree. If they find out you don't have a TV, people get very nervous and edgy, and well, you've got to have a TV. You got to watch this, or what have you. It's really quite funny. I don't have a TV because I find televisions boring. I mean, there may be a duller activity in the world than watching little patches of color jerk around on a glass screen, but I don't know of one. It just bores me. And so it's not a statement. It's not a sacrifice. I have other things to do. Why should I give that space in my living room?
But here's a big, big thing that I want to draw in on that is you can get caught up there. You can get caught up, those people who lived as Victorians. They could have done that as a reaction. They could have done it as an identity, which I would say was getting, that would be getting caught back up in the sort of narcissism of the culture, as Christopher Lasch would say, or purposely doing an archaic way of doing things. And this is one of the rules of magic, which you emphasize in the book. And so you said when you were first studying, you prepare the ritual, you do the ritual, and then people forget the very key third step: shut the hell up, right? And
yes,
I think
will, to dare, and to be silent.
And that's the thing is, I think when you disengage, when you don't perform that final step of keep it to yourself, keep the energy to yourself, you're sort of willingly giving over your energy back to that culture. This culture does not, Western culture at the moment does not want you to be silent. They want you to have an opinion because they can profit off that. Being silent and someone says, so why don't you have a nice car on credit? But saying, I don't need to give you a reason. That is power. And that's the silence, I think, right there.
Yeah, because to do not engage, a refusal to engage the system, it gives you the power to simply walk away. And in magic and in a whole range of other things. One of the things that every creative artist knows is that talking about what you're doing is a great way never to do it. When I'm working on a novel, I do not talk about it. Because if I talk about it, it just sort of trickles away. If I bottle that up in myself, it takes shape. And in the same way, to be able to stand apart from society, to not talk about something, is a source of immense power, because it makes you become aware of how you're communicating and how you're not communicating. It forces you to be aware of yourself, to think about, what are you saying? What are you doing? What is this? How are you participating in the world? You can't do that unconsciously if you say promise to keep something silent. This is one of the reasons that old-fashioned lodges had such powerful influence on people, and tended to make people who were more perceptive, more aware of themselves, because they had to be. Because if you take a vow that you're going to keep silent about these 4 mystic words. Now, the words can be gibberish. It doesn't matter. It's the fact that you're keeping silent about them. You are not making them part of the sort of common currency of the chattering classes, and that teaches you things.
I'm strangely reminded of perhaps one of my favorite philosophical sort of pieces ever written, which is by Michel Serres and his scathing critique of Socrates, actually, because Socrates is so well known for constantly voicing something, but because of his constantly voicing his rebellion, it just never really amounted to anything. And Michel Serres imagines the situation where he's finally tied up Socrates and fed him a poison, but unfortunately the poison works from the feet up. So up until the last moment, Socrates is just continuously blabbering about, the kids rebelling until finally the poison gets to his neck and sort of stops him talking. But it's and it makes me think also of Crowley, and probably the reason why there's something that doesn't sit right about his sincerity and authenticity, and whereas other Thelemites it does, Grady McMurtry, is Crowley didn't shut up.
Yeah, he had 3 of the basic rules down, and he did have 3 of them down. He was to know, to will, to dare. He did all of those things, but he could never shut his mouth. And the thing is, I've come to have a certain sympathy for Crowley, because if you ever have a chance to look at his natal horoscope, he has the horoscope of a bland little man, the kind of a person who would become a minor bureaucrat in the Home Office and write slightly off-color poetry, which we publish in little chap books. And that would be his life. And I think he sensed that, and he rebelled against it. And he set out to become something interesting, and that he did. He accomplished that. I suppose that's a testimony to the power of magic. But I think he was the whole time. He was on stage his entire life, trying to be something remarkable and dramatic and colorful, to avoid what he knew he actually was.
But I think there's probably something sort of telling in that general culture, this idea of a stage, is so pronounced now that everyone is in, and everyone feels compelled to constantly. Yeah. If you've gone to it's sort of the old, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to see it, doesn't make a sound. I mean, in terms of the West, it's like you could even say, if you did a thing and you didn't take a picture of it, did you actually do it?
Yeah, if a tree falls in the forest and didn't post a selfie of it falling to the internet, did it actually fall? Exactly. And there's a lot of that. I had somebody on one of my open posts the other day who wanted to know, like how I live my life and what I do with my time and like how I brush my teeth and all this kind of stuff. I'm going, guy, come on.
The cult of the biography.
Exactly.
Everything has to be interesting. This is a strange thing for me that I occasionally peruse, and there's almost like it's almost like checking in on a patient in a way. I occasionally look at the live streams on a site called Twitch, which live streams people gaming or people doing whatever or blah blah blah, and there's thousands and thousands of people just watching other people do nothing. And I'm not exaggerating.
I know.
These people are like,
I'm sure you aren't.
The title of the video will be like me programming something, and that's it. There's thousands and thousands of people, and I can't get to the kernel of this. I can't understand.
I'm seeing the perfect recursive prank on that. You have a video of yourself watching yourself on Twitch.
Please tell me you've heard of the TV show Gogglebox.
I haven't.
Okay, John. You're gonna have to probably
reveal to me this mystery.
Get a box of Prozac ready. I will explain to you the beauty of Gogglebox. Okay, this is a Balladian nightmare rolled into one. This is an extremely popular program in the UK. This is on Channel 4. Okay, one of the big Gogglebox is a TV show where you watch other people watching TV. You don't see what they're watching. You watch their reactions of them watching shows. And this has hundreds and hundreds of episodes. And the people who are watching TV, these are just ordinary people. And these, of course, now all have, followers and people are fans of these people watching TV. So there it is. If that isn't the death rattle of Western culture.
That's actually Gogglebox?
Gogglebox, yeah.
Gogglebox. I will look that up because that as a metaphor, that's just so beautiful. Yeah, where you consume the experience of other people consuming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the death rattle of of the consumer society, the death rattle of the industrial age, is people staring at each other watching television. It'd be great if the people who were being filmed on Gogglebox were watching Gogglebox.
Yeah.
And there you have this perfect recursive loop, and they all vanish up each other's backsides.
But when you do that, I mean, I remember my favorite little short story of mine, which is in the back of Foster Wallace's novel Infinite Jest, which is called it's called The Joke, and the idea was that it's like an art installation. You put 1,000 people in a theater with a screen in front of them, and all that happens is when the lights dim down, there's a little camera, and it just shows them themselves in live feed, so that they have to face themselves, and eventually everyone just gets uncomfortable and leaves because they're faced with the reality of what it is they're actually doing. So I think that would happen with Gogglebox if you finally showed someone a footage. You know, this is you right now from the third position. This is you. This is what you're doing with your finite time. Dear me.
Yeah.
So, you know, back to the book. Is there anything you'd like to add? I mean, we've sort of got a bit off track, but I think it all does connect.
I think it will. Well, basically, my book is not an easy book for a lot of people. Will not be an easy book for a lot of people to read. It deals with politics in a very unfamiliar sense. That is, it's not blathering about values. It's talking about who is making money, who is benefiting from this, and who is not, from a range of policies that are almost always these days framed in terms of values. And so it's an uncomfortable look. It is a genuinely edgy book. And I hope that a fair number of our listeners will read it. I am sure that a fair number of those listeners will throw it across the room at least once. And if they don't, I'll be a little disappointed because it's meant to shake people up a bit.
Okay, that's good. So, 24th of June in the UK, is that the US release date as well?
U.S. release, I think the last I heard, because we were able to get some of the details done early, I think they're going to happen in late May, but I'm not sure of that. But at any rate, it is already available for advance order, and it will be coming out just as soon as the printing presses roll.
So that's Amazon, the Inner Traditions site, and you also have a new site as well.
Yeah, if anyone goes to either my blog at ecosofia.net or so on, I now sell my books through Bookshop, and in fact you can just go to bookshop.org, I think it is, and if you punch in a search for John Michael Greer, you'll find me.
Lovely. Okay, seems like a good place to finish up. John Michael Greer, thanks very much.
Thank you for having me on.